and the difficulties associated with each of them. So this paper raises more questions than it answers, but my hope is that seeing the questions more clearly will itself be a contribution to discussion about the answers. So the nature of the problem. We can begin reflection on the question about the nature of the atonement by considering the purpose of the atonement. There is little, if any, controversy in theological circles, now or in the history of Christian philosophy and theology, over the claim that the atonement is a solution to a problem. But what's the problem? The word atonement was coined to express the nature of the solution, and so the word itself gives us a direction in which to go to understand the character of the problem. Atonement is an invented word composed of at and one jammed together with meant, and it was devised to express the idea that the atonement is a making one of things that were previously not at one, namely God and human beings. So if at-one-ment is the solution to a problem, then it seems the problem should be thought of as the absence of unity between God and human beings. As Augustine and the Christian tradition after him see the problem, its source lies in the will. It consists in the will's intractability to itself, its proneness to moral evil or sin, even against its own desires for the good. Without doubt, this impairment in the will is correlated also with impairment in intellect. But as Augustine and the subsequent tradition tend to see it, the fundamental defect is in the will. On views such as Augustine's, this fragmentation in the will, this proneness to moral evil or sin, is the problem to which the atonement is the solution. In what follows, I'm going to assume that this view is standard for orthodox interpretations of the doctrine of the atonement, and I'm going to take it for granted in thinking about interpretations of the doctrine. That brings me to the elements of the problem, and this is the point at which your text will be on track with what I'm saying. So understood, the problem to which the atonement is the solution has multiple components, and they need correspondingly different remedies in any solution to the problem that is to be successful. In the first place, there is the very proneness to sin itself. While this defect in will remains in a person, it makes a person liable to wrongdoing in the future. That this is so, and widely known to be so, undermines community and impedes closeness between persons. Our laws, customs, and manners are designed to protect each of us against the others, because each of us knows that any of the others is capable even of great evils, of betraying trust, of breaking relationships, of things as terrible as molesting a child. In fact, the defect in the will not only makes it difficult for a person to live with others, it also makes it difficult for him to live with himself. One can distrust oneself as well as others, and such distrust is an additional obstacle to human closeness with others. One source of a person's insecurity in relationships is the fear on his part that if others really knew him, they would want to reject him. If fear and insecurity get the upper hand in a psyche, they can have the added disadvantage of producing greater or lesser degrees of self-deception. A person can shield himself from things about himself he's unable or unwilling to face, with the result that he becomes seriously self-deceived about himself. And of course, suppressing parts of one's personality or hiding oneself from oneself in self-deception only increases distance from others. One is then alienated both from oneself and from others. It's not hard to understand why a person prone to sin would be subject to anxiety and even depression. For all these reasons, the defect in the will is a serious obstacle to flourishing in one's own life and in one's relations to other persons. And of course, for these same or similar reasons, it's also a major source of distance from God. These difficulties constitute the first component in the problem of sin to which I want to call attention. We can think of it as the future-looking component of the problem, whose source is the defect in the human will, insofar as its effects are felt in the present to be destructive of human flourishing in relationship with other persons, including God most notably, in the time that is future with respect to now. But there is obviously also a component to the problem of human sin that has to do with the past. On Christian doctrine, with the exception of the incarnate Christ, every human person who does not die before the age of reason, whenever that might be, is not only prone to sin, but has also actually done sinful actions. Every such person can look back to a past in which he has done things that are serious moral wrongs and that go contrary to God's will and/or God's nature. The result is that every person past the age of reason suffers from guilt with regard to at least some past actions. I don't mean that every person suffers from feelings of guilt. That's no doubt true, but it's not my point here. The point is that every person past the age of reason is actually guilty, whether he feels it or not. His life history includes his having done serious moral wrongs, and guilt. His life history includes his having done serious moral wrongs, and guilt is not the end of the problem as regards past sin. There's also shame. That's part of the backward-looking component of the problem engendered by the defect in the human will, too. Here also, I don't mean that every person guilty of moral wrongdoing feels shame in consequence of what he's done. No doubt shame is ubiquitous, too. But I mean only that in consequence of past sin, a person in fact is shamed, somehow less lovely or less honorable than he might have been had he not sinned. No one doubts that guilt and shame are distinct, but there's considerable controversy over the nature of the distinction. In other work, I've argued that when guilt and shame are both present and felt, the difference between shame and guilt can be understood in terms of the two desires of love on the account of love I've defended elsewhere. I can't recapitulate that whole discussion here, but roughly summarized, on this account, love consists in two mutually interacting desires: a desire for the good of the beloved and a desire for union with the beloved. A shamed person and a guilty person each anticipates a repudiation on the part of real or imagined others of both the desires of love as regards himself. But a person in the grip of guilt will tend to be focused more on the first desire, and a person suffering from shame will tend to worry more about the second. That is, a guilty person anticipates anger on the part of real or imagined others, and so he's anxious about things others may impose on him which are punishments in their view and which are not for his good in some sense of good in his view. His concern is therefore that real or imagined others will lack for him the first desire of love, the desire for the good for him as he sees it. By contrast, a shamed person anticipates rejection and abandonment on the part of real or imagined others, and so he's anxious about marginalization or isolation. His anxiety is directed toward a distance, an absence of union forced on him by others with whom he himself desires some kind of closeness. His worry is therefore that real or imagined others will lack for him the second desire of love, the desire for union with him. So a person who feels guilty believes it would be appropriate for others to be angry at him and to punish him, where the punishment is something he doesn't want because he doesn't see it as good for himself. But a person who feels shamed believes it would be appropriate for others to reject not his good, but him. And of course, when the person whose punishment or rejection is feared is God, the problems of guilt and shame are correspondingly much greater. On this way of thinking about shame, it's more intractable than guilt. We're accustomed to think of the antidote to guilt as repentance and forgiveness, or maybe as repentance, forgiveness, and penance. Shame, however, is a response to one's deformity in consequence of something in the history of one's life. And that history, like everything else about the past, is fixed and unalterable. On the view of virtually all philosophers and theologians, even